Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the new radar UI menu for anti-airs in the game of War Thunder. Now, as some of you may know, the radar UI menu was added in the Leviathan's update, and it does feature some interesting quirks that we're going to go into in addition to its basic functions in this video. Now, the first quirk is actually the button mapping process. It turns out when you go into the radar UI's button maps actually override your normal button maps, and this is a bit of an issue for finding a button that will take you into the UI and also out of the UI because it has to already not be used. And as far as I can tell, there is no way to remap the buttons in the radar UI itself, although that might come at some point. So for the time being, I currently just use the multifunction menu to go into the radar UI, as normally you don't have to do it all that quickly. Now, the first and most obvious feature that you'll notice when you go into the UI is actually the big radar screen dead center. This is pretty standard and pretty similar to the radar screen that you had basically as a small little icon previously, so there's not really that much to go into. The only thing that I would say is interesting is if you look at the bottom, you do have controls to both switch the radar itself on or off, switch to radar or IRST, change the scope scale, and lock targets. So you can do all of that from completely within the UI without having to leave it, which is pretty nice. Additionally, you can also fire primary, secondary, and activate the seekers for missiles that have them. Now, on the right hand side of the screen, you're going to see the target list. The target list lists all the available targets that are currently tracked on your radar. And what's interesting is as new distinct objects are detected, they will be automatically assigned a number. And as far as I can tell, your system will try to keep the same number on the same object. So that means that if you see plane number 3 and then it disappears without being shot down, and then that exact same vehicle comes back, it will still be called plane number 3. Now, one thing to note about the target list is that while the range is generally pretty accurate, as is the IFF, dictating whether it is an enemy or whether it is an ally, the other aspects of the vehicle are going to vary a bit based on whether or not you have locked the target and how good your radar is. If your radar is specifically pointing at a target, you will get more specific targeting information on most systems. Additionally, if you do have some of the more advanced radar, it might just have all the information you need without actually having to lock the target. So it varies a bit from radar to radar. Additionally, if you start getting more advanced radars, not only is it simply telling you whether it's an enemy or a friendly, but it will actually tell you what type of vehicle or even the specific model of vehicle in some cases. So it is a pretty handy feature. Now, the next two features are interesting because they're not actually universal. The main radar system and the target list are on all of the vehicles that I could find that have this feature. However, the two features on the left-hand side of the screen are not. The first one is the sight view. Now, most vehicles do have a sight view, but some of the higher tier anti-airs that don't actually have a weapon sight by default do not have one. This essentially shows you what your launcher is currently looking at. Now, one thing to note about the sight view is that you can manually activate the night vision and you can zoom in or out. However, the zoom level is based on the zoom level of your actual sights, so this doesn't do anything that your sight couldn't normally do. This does bring up my first tip, however, because what I always do when going into this site is I always go into maximum zoom and also turn on thermals if I have them before going into the radar UI, because it will retain all of those settings when I go into the UI and I don't have to worry about pressing any of those buttons. And it turns out, generally speaking, you don't really need to zoom out at all while you're doing these engagements, and usually you also want thermals on far more often than you don't. That being said, not every anti-air even has sights or even a zoom feature, and quite a few of them don't have thermal imaging, so it's not universal. It doesn't work on every vehicle, but I would recommend it for the vehicles that have it. The next feature, and the one that is immediately below the sight view on the left-hand side, is the elevation azimuth indicator. And this is kind of interesting because it's almost exclusively used on some of the higher end anti-aircraft systems. And what this basically is showing you a visualization of what it would look like if you took the main circle of the radar and basically just flattened it out into a line. You can actually see on the bottom it has the degrees from 0 degrees all the way up to 360, so that's the 360 degrees of the radar circle, but it also shows you the altitude of all targets within that circle. So it gives you at least some idea of both where things are around you and also how high or low they are flying. Again, this is not available on all radar sets and mostly seems to be limited to the higher end ones. So we've discussed what the UI is essentially and what what the different parts are, the question is, how do you actually engage targets with this radar UI? And the first thing I would say is what you do is you select a target from the target list that you want to shoot down, and once you select that target, your radar will attempt to point at the target, and once your radar has pointed at the target, you can then lock on and fire. Now, if you want to know if you can lock on to the target, you will see these small brackets around it indicating that your radar has picked it up and it is within your scan arc. And additionally, if you want to know when you have successfully locked on, you will see a small circle appear over the target. Now, there are a lot of nuances because it turns out there are quite a few different types of weapons that you can use from this interface, so we're going to go into those shortly. The first type are basic guns. Basic guns do require a lock because the lock is what gives you the lead indicator to actually fire the guns. It turns out the radar isn't magic, it isn't doing anything different, it's just presenting a new UI for you to use things you already have. So the actual lead crosshair that you get when you lock onto a plane is essentially what your guns are going to be firing at, which means you need a lock in order to get that lead crosshair. Once you lock a target, the guns will then automatically train to the point of lead, and you can simply press the fire button and it will tap off bursts of however many you want to shoot. For infrared missiles, obviously you have to do the same things you normally have to do with an infrared missile. That is to say, you have to make sure the seeker is on, make sure the seeker can see the target and has a good lock, and then you simply fire it. You don't necessarily have to manually lock a target with infrared seekers, you just have to make sure the seeker is pointed at and can get a lock on the target. Now, the more interesting one is actually the SACLOS missiles. SACLOS missiles are the type of missiles you have on things like the Panzer, the OSHA, aka the Gecko, things like the Roland, etc. These types of missiles, if you successfully find a target and also lock them, will actually track the target and plot a small amount of lead to the target so that they will generally hit what they're aiming at, assuming it's within range. Of note, these SACLOS missiles do require a lock. They will not shoot without it, so keep that in mind. However, if you are locked, it will actually be quite difficult for opponents to evade, and I did find, generally speaking, that even when people took evasive action, these missiles could connect far more often than not. Now, the last types of weapons we're going to talk about are really the new batch of missiles that were added to top tier, and also to a lesser extent the Panzer. The types of radars that were added with a lot of the new top tier anti-air are actually radars that can track multiple targets simultaneously. For a lot of these vehicles, you don't actually need a hard lock to fire at the target. The Panzer is one of them. You simply acquire the target and then you fire your weapon and the missile will fly towards the target regardless of whether or not you maintain a lock. In the case of the Panzer, even though its missiles are not fire and forget, you do still have to keep the target painted, but your missile will still generally track it even without a lock pretty efficiently. Obviously, for the fire and forget top tier missiles where you only have to have the target marked with your radar, you don't necessarily need a hard lock. You simply acquire the lock and you fire and the missile will do its own thing, and you don't even need a hard lock at any point in that process. You just need to be able to briefly see the target and make sure your missile seeker knows where it is. Of course, the real question is ultimately how good or how useful is this system? In terms of gun-based AA, my anecdotal experience was ultimately the system is not very good. Essentially, the biggest limitation to gun-based AA is usually range, and this system doesn't really fix that. It doesn't enhance the range at which you can get a lead indicator, it simply goes after the lead indicator. So generally speaking, you're going to struggle to land hits outside of 2 kilometers with gun-based AA, just like you did before, unless the enemy's flying in a straight line. Or to put that in other terms, anything that you can hit with this system with gun-based AA, you probably could have hit by just being in the third-person camera and putting your crosshair on the lead indicator, because they basically engage at the same distance. At distances where you don't get a lead indicator, the system just defaults to firing directly at the target, and obviously that will never hit the target. So ultimately, for gun-based AA systems, the added tunnel vision you get while in this UI I found to be kind of limiting, and any benefit for it was pretty marginal. For some of the more basic infrared missiles, things like Stingers or Iglas, I found the system was at best situational and at worst kind of useless or even detrimental. The big thing with these infrared missiles, especially the early ones, is that you can lock target and then you can aim ahead of the target so your missile doesn't have to pull as many Gs, which this system doesn't really do. So on the whole, I found the system was actually worse for a lot of these early IR missiles than it is for the later ones, and I wouldn't really recommend it. And much like like with the gun-based AA, there is a tendency to tunnel vision while you're in this mode because you don't have the best situational awareness. So I would rather just keep the mode off, use my normal radar, and use my normal Mark 1 eyeballs and thermal imaging if I have it to find targets, because I just don't really find this adds anything. For gun-based AA with proximity fuses, I found the results were basically the same. The proximity fuses do give you a little bit more wiggle room in terms of how close you can get to the target and still land a hit, and obviously as the gun does basically automatically fire at the lead indicator, as long as you have a good lead indicator, it should hit more often than it doesn't. The lead indicator itself is still ultimately limited by the ballistics of the shell, so on the whole I found, much like gun-based AA, the gun-based AA with proximity fuses has basically the same issues, where you might as well just lock the target and fire at it normally from the third person, because in most cases you will get basically the same result. I did see some individuals commenting that for the Automatique it was especially good, but after doing some testing with other proximity fuse based gun systems, my initial impression on that is it might just be placebo. Ultimately, if you can hit relatively close to the lead indicator and spray around a little, you'll usually get about the same result that you will with this radar system, and honestly it probably won't even save you that much ammo either. The SACLOS missile systems, however, were a horse of a different color. Things like the Flak-Panzer, the OSHA, etc. These things dramatically improve their performance with the radar scope, because the missiles themselves tend to basically automatically hit a target unless it can pull some pretty extreme Gs or break the lock. So to put it simply, all of the missile-based penultimate systems right before top tier that use radar-guided missiles did effectively end up acting like semi-active radar homing missiles, in that they could reliably hit targets unless the target could do something pretty crazy to break the lock. Previously, it wasn't actually that difficult to break the aim of a human player by simply doing some modest maneuvers that would throw them off a little, but with this radar system, that's not the case, and they will pretty reliably hit you with most of these penultimate anti-air systems pretty easily, unless you can do some pretty efficient maneuvers to avoid it. If you are using any of these early radar-based missile systems, I would highly recommend getting comfortable with this radar UI, because it is a huge benefit. Of course, by the time you get to a lot of the top tier anti-aircraft systems, this radar UI is almost essential for them to function on the most basic level, as many of them don't have a normal gun sight view as we know it, but when you go into the radar view, it is actually very easy to parse through the different types of enemies and allies in the air, figure out which one you want to shoot at, and direct your weapons accordingly. So for a lot of these top tier anti-aircraft systems, I would highly recommend getting comfortable with this system, because you are going to be using it a lot, and it is in general going to be the most efficient way to both track and engage targets. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. Please feel free to let me know in the comments down below what you think of the new radar UI. Have you tried it out? Do you like it? Do you hate it? I always love to hear from you guys. If you like the video, you enjoy the channel, like and subscribe always helps out. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.